Hey guys, CJ with Elevated Systems, and today we're checking out the Jonsbow D32 Standard and D32 Pro. Now, before we get into the specs and features, the key thing about these cases is the sheer number of cutouts on the motherboard tray designed specifically for rear connect motherboards. I love seeing more cases built for these ultra clean setups. The downside, there are barely any micro ATX rear connect motherboards out there. Right now, the only options are the MSI Project Zero B650 and the Asus TUF Gaming B760M BTF. Both are priced way higher than your average micro ATX board, which kind of misses the point. Most builders go with micro ATX to save some cash while keeping the essentials. But here's the good news. These cases don't just support rear connect boards. Any micro ATX motherboard will work just fine, which is perfect since my standard case test system runs a regular B650M. So let's take a closer look at both models and break down what sets them apart. The Jonsbow D32 cases are compact tower micro ATX cases designed for mini ITX or micro ATX motherboards. The D32 standard measures 395mm long, 207mm wide, and 314mm tall. The D32 Pro is just 1mm longer thanks to a small panel on the back of the case. The D32 Standard and D32 Pro in B mode support CPU tower coolers up to 164mm tall for Intel processors and 163mm for AMD processors. The D32 Pro in A mode increases those clearances to 170mm for Intel and 169mm for AMD, and I'll break down A and B modes in just a bit. Both cases officially support graphics cards up to 365mm in length. However, this depends entirely on the power supply. If the PSU extends past the PCIe slots, it's going to interfere with the GPU. For example, if the graphics card is installed in the first PCIe slot, the PSU can't exceed 150mm. If the GPU is in the second slot, the maximum PSU length increases to 170mm. But power supply cables can also get in the way, and I'll cover that in the build notes. The cases are also compatible with SFX and SFXL power supplies using the included bracket. Neither case includes pre-installed fans, but you can install two 120 or 140mm fans on top and up to three 120mm or two 140mm fans on the bottom. There's also space for a single 120mm rear exhaust fan. Alternatively, you can mount a 240mm AIO on the top panel. For storage, there are mounting points behind the motherboard tray for up to three 2.5-inch SSDs or two SSDs and one 3.5-inch hard drive. The D32 Pro adds an extra mounting point on the bottom of the case for either an SSD or hard drive. The front I/O panel differs slightly between the models. The D32 Standard includes a power button, a 5GB per second Type A port, a 10GB per second Type C port, and a 3.5mm headset jack. The D32 Pro adds a second 5GB per second Type A port for extra connectivity. All right, let's talk about the things that set these two cases apart. The most obvious difference is the ventilation. Both cases share the overall same styling, but the D32 Standard uses a finer 1.5mm square pixelated ventilation pattern, while the D32 Pro opts for larger 4.5mm openings. However, the Pro model backs those larger vents with a more restrictive mesh filter. Another key distinction is the right side panel. The standard version has a solid steel panel, while the Pro version swaps that out for a full mesh panel. If you prefer a fully meshed look, you can swap the right tempered glass panel with the mesh panel. Of course, I'll be testing how all this affects thermal performance a bit later. Next up, the power supply shroud. The D32 Standard has a full height vertical shroud panel that helps hide the PSU and the cables at the front of the case. The D32 Pro, on the other hand, uses a shorter shroud panel, but adds a bottom panel to keep the PSU cables from spilling into the bottom of the case. There are pros and cons to both, which I'll break down in the build notes. The D32 Pro also comes with a few extra accessories, including a graphics card support bracket, a cable management shroud, and a small plastic storage case for the screws and hardware. But the biggest design difference is the adjustable motherboard tray in the D32 Pro. Out of the box, the case is set up in A mode, which accommodates standard front connect motherboards while giving you an extra 6 millimeters of clearance for CPU, cooler, and GPU height. If you're using a rear connect motherboard, you can move the tray forward 6 millimeters by removing a few screws. Seems a little backwards to me. Since this case is meant for rear connect boards, you'd think it would ship in that configuration by default, but it is an option here. And finally, there's the price. At the time of filming, the D32 Standard cost $63, while the D32 Pro comes in at $70. When it comes to build quality, Jonsbow has gone with thinner steel, which is pretty standard for a case at this price point. I measured it at about 0.75 millimeters, including the powder coat. This means you'll need to handle the case with a little extra care during the build process. Apply too much force and you could drive a fan screw right through the steel or strip a thumb screw hole. That said, despite the lighter construction and the modular frame of the Pro model, the overall fit and finish is solid. There's no noticeably large panel gaps or misalignments. However, be sure to keep a hand on the glass panel when removing the thumb screws. Once they're out, the panel has a tendency to just fall right off the case. When it comes to my build experience, I installed my standard test system in both cases. Check the system specs in the description below. The D32 Standard and D32 Pro differ from similar cases like the Lian Li A3, Asus AP201, and Sama IM01 Pro in one notable way. The PSU mounting bracket is fixed, and honestly, that's fine. There's plenty of room for a 240 millimeter without the need to lower the PSU, and a 360 millimeter AIO doesn't fit in here at all. So an adjustable PSU bracket like in those other cases probably isn't really necessary here. One quick note on motherboard installation: the bottom front standoff isn't pre-installed, so you'll need to take care of that before mounting the board. For cooling, I installed 3 120 millimeter fans, 1 in the rear and 2 up top, all set at exhaust for a full negative pressure setup. If you opt for a top-mounted AIO, a standard 55 millimeter thick unit will sit high enough to avoid interference with RAM modules or VRM heat sinks. However, chunkier AIOs like the Arctic Liquid Freezer might run into clearance issues. Now let's talk about graphics card clearance. My card is 330 millimeters long, and since my M.2 SSD is installed in the first slot in this motherboard, the GPU installs in the second PCI slot. In this configuration, the card barely fits under my 158 millimeter PSU, brushing against some of the cables, but still managing to just fit. However, the card wouldn't have fit if it was in the top PCIe slot. In the D32 Pro, the bottom section of the PSU bracket is adjustable. I had to lower it to its second lowest position to fit my PSU, and again, the GPU just barely fit underneath. Like with the standard case, the card couldn't be installed in the top slot due to clearance issues. Another clearance consideration, my 2.5 slot graphics card in the second PCIe slot leaves only 20 millimeters of space below it. This means standard 25 millimeter thick fans won't fit in the bottom of the case as intake fans. Cable management in both cases was straightforward. There are plenty of tie-down points, all conveniently and strategically placed for both regular motherboards like the one I used and rear connect motherboards. Even in the Pro case, configured in A mode with its 6 millimeters less space behind there, I had no trouble tidying up the cable slack. Since I was using a standard motherboard, the Pro's cable management shroud worked nicely to hide some of the cables up front. However, the GPU support bracket only has a single mounting position, which unfortunately lined up with one of the fans of my graphics card. This made it unusable for my build. Now, let's talk about thermal performance. I tested both cases using the same system setup, comparing them to the results from an open-air test bench. For the test, I ran the AIDA64 stress test for the CPU and 20-minute Port Royal loops for the GPU. Bottom line up front, both cases performed identically, and the results were underwhelming. Across the board, CPU, GPU, and motherboard temps all were noticeably higher inside the case compared to the open-air test bench. Swapping the D32 Pro's mesh panel to the left side did lower temps by 1 degree across the board. but that's hardly a game changer. The issue is that the mesh backing behind the D32 Pro's larger ventilation pattern makes it just as restrictive as the D32 standard. While you can remove the backing mesh on the Pro to improve airflow, you'll sacrifice any dust mitigation, so it's a trade-off. Performance will also vary depending on your specific system setup, things like the number of fans, their type, and their placement. For example, adding bottom intakes fans can help balance airflow and improve temperatures. However, overall, these cases have significantly worse thermal performance compared to other cases in their class. So, overall thoughts on the Jonsbow D32 cases. First off, with such minimal differences between the two models and only a $7 price difference, I'm not sure there's really a need for both versions to exist. The lack of pre-installed fans is also a drawback. Builders shopping in the sub $100 price range often expect value-added features like pre-installed fans, unlike higher budget DIY builders who prefer to pick their own. And again, while I love seeing more cases designed to support rear connect motherboards, it's important to note that the Sama IM01 Pro also caters to the same niche, but with better overall performance. This makes it more compelling options for builders focused on functionality and thermals, especially if you're already investing in high-end components like a rear connect motherboard. The D32 cases might stand out for their design, but in terms of thermal efficiency and practicality, the competition is a bit stronger. Another consideration is planning your build carefully, particularly around graphics card and PSU sizes and clearances. The fixed PSU bracket designs means you'll need to account for how your components fit together to avoid clearance issues, especially if you plan to use bottom-mounted fans or larger GPUs. That said, despite the compromise inherent to this price point, the overall style of the D32 cases does stand out. The D32 Pro's pixelated mesh design adds a slightly more unique take on the standard mesh case aesthetic, and if I had to recommend one, it would be the Pro model. For just an extra $7, you get more features and flexibility like the adjustable motherboard tray and mesh side panel options, and the added accessory pack. So, if you found this review helpful, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you're into tech reviews, build guides, or just geeking out over the latest gear, consider subscribing for more content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.